Fertility rate of a country is highly dependent on a number of factors, one of the most important being economic factors. Total fertility rate is the expected number of births a woman would have throughout her lifetime. Our presentation will examine the relationship between fertility or total fertility rate and GDP or gross domestic product per capita. This graph from Gapminder displays a negative correlation between total fertility rate and GDP per capita for countries around the world. This indicates that as a country's GDP increases, its total fertility rate will decrease, and therefore that poorer countries tend to have more children. Why is fertility rate so much higher in poorer countries? Poorer countries tend to have high infant mortality rates, and in poorer countries, children tend to take care of their elderly parents as adults. In richer countries, more economically independent women have less of an incentive to get married and have children, and due to the cost of higher education, parents may choose to have fewer but more educated children. Throughout the video, we will observe this correlation between income and fertility among low GDP, mid-level GDP, and high GDP countries. Level GDP countries or developing countries seem to have a fertility rate that is lower than that of the high GDP countries but higher than that of the low GDP countries. These are countries that have begun the process of modernization and are adapting to new technology that is already present in high GDP countries. China, for example, begins with a low GDP but a high fertility rate. Because of China's one-child policy in the 1970s, fertility rates dropped steadily and quickly, but GDP remains unaffected, displaying that fertility rates do not heavily impact GDP per capita. When China's GDP per capita indeed increases starting in the late 90s, fertility rates slowly decrease and then plateau until they reach 1.64 babies per woman in the year 2018. This conveys that GDP per capita growth does have a negative impact on fertility rates. Like China, India starts out with a low GDP at around 6 babies per woman. GDP per capita increases rapidly beginning in the 70s as India begins to establish a country and economy independent from the United Kingdom, and fertility rates plummet to 2.28 babies per woman in 2018, the more that the income per person increases.
There are many low-income countries worldwide, as defined by the World Population Review, of having a people that have a GDP per capita of less than 1,026 United States dollars. All of them are located in Asia as well as sub-Saharan Africa. The two countries I'm going to look at are Uganda and Madagascar. In the year 1800, Uganda had a fertility rate of 6.89 children per woman, during which it was still an independent nation. The birth rate remains remarkably constant for over a century, as the GDP per capita only grows extremely slow. Post-independence in 1962, birth rates actually increased with GDP per capita but remained steady, even when it falls during a period of instability and dictatorship. Despite this, by the late 1990s, GDP per capita begins to slowly increase and fertility rates fall into the pattern of declining in this negative correlation as well. By 2018, we see a fertility rate of 5.41 children per woman. Although this decline is fairly new, it has remained steady, and my assumption is that it will continue to fall as GDP increases.
The inverse relationship between income and fertility has been termed a demographic economic paradox. Thomas Malthus proposed that greater means would enable the production of more offspring. However, roughly speaking, nations or subpopulations with higher GDP per capita are observed to have a lower fertility rate as seen in the chart. This is a paradox. It is hypothesized that the observed trend in many developed countries of having fewer children has come about as a response to increased life expectancy, reduced childhood mortality, improved female literacy and independence, and urbanization that all result from increased GDP per capita, consistent with the demographic transition model. The increase in GDP in Eastern Europe after 1990 has been correlated with childbearing postponement and a sharp decline in fertility. A related concern is that high birth rates tend to place a greater burden of children rearing and education on populations already struggling with poverty. Consequently, inequality lowers average education and hampers economic growth. Also, in countries with a high burden of this kind, a reduction in fertility can hamper economic growth as well as the other way around.
So, as is shown by all the data in the graphs, we can conclude that regardless of the country's initial GDP per capita, as it begins to steadily increase, birth rates begin to decline as well.